The Johnson family home was always brimming with the noise of life, laughter, conversation, sometimes arguments, but today it was unusually quiet. Sara stood at the kitchen window, her hands absently scrubbing a plate as she stared out into the backyard. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the grass where her two children used to play. But today, the scene felt heavy, weighed down by the tension that had crept into their home. Her husband, Tim, was sitting in the living room, his back hunched over his phone. He hadn't spoken to her since the argument that morning, when voices had been raised and words had been flung carelessly, like knives that could never be retrieved. Their fights had become more frequent over the past year, as the pressures of work, money, and family mounted, leaving them both frayed at the edges. Sara knew the root of their issues wasn't just between them. It extended beyond their marriage and into the complex web of family relationships. Her mother-in-law, Evelyn, had recently moved in after suffering a minor stroke, and the strain of her presence had changed the atmosphere in the house. Tim, caught between the needs of his wife and the obligations to his mother, was struggling to keep the peace. Sara, in turn, felt like a stranger in her own home, her every move scrutinized by Evelyn's sharp eyes and her every decision questioned. That morning's fight had started small, like they always did. Sara had asked Tim if he could take the kids to school, and he had snapped, claiming he was already running late for work. Before she knew it, they were shouting about responsibilities, about how she never got a break, and how he felt like he was constantly under pressure to please everyone. But beneath the surface of their argument were the real issues. Tim's frustration wasn't just about work. It was about the unspoken resentment he harbored over the way his mother treated Sara. And Sara, tired of trying to be the perfect wife and daughter-in-law, had reached her breaking point. She loved Tim, but the man she had married seemed to be slipping away, consumed by his own stress and unwilling to stand up to his mother. Evelyn's arrival had shifted the balance in their home. Once a family of 4, now they were 5, with Evelyn's presence looming over everything like a storm cloud. Sara had tried to be accommodating, setting up the guest room for her mother-in-law and ensuring she had everything she needed during her recovery. But Evelyn wasn't the easiest person to live with. She had opinions about everything, from how the children should be raised to how Sara managed the household. Every interaction with Evelyn felt like walking on eggshells, and no matter how hard Sara tried, she could never seem to get it right. "Sara, dear, I don't think the kids should be watching so much TV," Evelyn had commented the other day, her voice laced with passive aggression. "In my day, we spent time doing more productive things." Sara had bitten her tongue, as she often did, but inside she fumed. It wasn't just the constant criticism, it was the way Evelyn undermined her authority as a mother and wife. Tim, caught in the middle, seemed reluctant to intervene, which only deepened Sara's resentment. She couldn't understand why he didn't stand up for her, why he let his mother dictate how things were run in their own home. The tension had spread to other family members as well. Sara's own parents had noticed the strain during a recent visit, and her mother had pulled her aside, asking quietly, "Are you okay, honey? You don't seem yourself lately." Sara had brushed it off with a forced smile, unwilling to admit just how suffocated she felt. How could she explain the complicated dynamics of living with her mother-in-law without sounding ungrateful or disloyal? It wasn't that she didn't care about Evelyn's health, but the constant intrusion into their lives was driving a wedge between her and Tim. And then there was the issue of Tim's brother, Jake, who lived out of state and had conveniently managed to avoid any responsibility in caring for their mother. Whenever Tim tried to bring up the idea of Jake pitching in, the conversation ended in frustration. Jake always had an excuse: work, travel, or the fact that he just wasn't good at that kind of thing. Meanwhile, the burden fell squarely on Tim and Sara's shoulders, with no end in sight. That night, as Sara finished washing the dishes and wiped her hands on a towel, she heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind her. She turned to see Evelyn standing in the doorway, a tight smile on her face. "I think we need to talk," Evelyn said, her tone cold but polite. Sara sighed internally but nodded. She wasn't in the mood for another confrontation, but she knew avoiding it would only make things worse. "Okay," she said quietly, following Evelyn into the living room where Tim was still sitting, pretending to be engrossed in his phone. Evelyn sat down in the armchair across from Tim, motioning for Sara to join them. "I've been thinking about the situation here," she began, folding her hands in her lap. "I appreciate everything you've done for me since I moved in, but I can't help but feel that the tension in this house is becoming unbearable. We need to find a solution." Sara's stomach tightened. Was Evelyn going to suggest moving out? Or worse, was she about to blame all of the problems on her? "I don't want to be a burden," Evelyn continued, glancing at Tim. "But I also think it's important for everyone to understand that I'm still part of this family. My opinion should count for something, shouldn't it?" Tim looked up from his phone, his expression unreadable. "Of course, Mom," he said softly, but there was an edge to his voice. Sara's heart sank. This was it, the moment where Tim would side with his mother, yet again, and she would be left feeling like the outsider in her own home. But before Evelyn could continue, there was a loud knock at the front door. The sudden noise startled everyone, and Tim quickly stood up to answer it. When he opened the door, Sara could hear muffled voices, and a moment later, Tim returned with a man in a uniform standing behind him. A police officer. Sara's blood ran cold. What was happening? "Mrs. Johnson?" the officer asked, his eyes scanning the room. "Yes," Sara replied, her voice trembling. "We've received a report about an ongoing family dispute at this address. I'm here to check on the situation." Sara was stunned. Who would have called the police? Her mind raced, but before she could process it, Evelyn spoke up, her voice filled with indignation. "This is ridiculous. We're just having a family discussion. There's no need for the police to be involved." The officer remained calm, his gaze steady. "We've had complaints from a neighbor about loud arguments over the past few weeks. I'm here to make sure everyone is safe." Sara's heart pounded in her chest as the realization hit her. Their constant arguments, the yelling, the tension. It hadn't gone unnoticed. The neighbors had been listening, and now the police were involved. Tim's face was pale as he turned to Sara, his eyes filled with guilt and shame. "I had no idea it had gotten this bad," he whispered, his voice barely audible. The officer, sensing the tension in the room, took a step back. "I'm going to recommend you all take a moment to calm down and consider seeking some help. Family counseling, perhaps. It's clear there's a lot of unresolved issues here." As the officer left, the house fell into a heavy silence. No one spoke for a long moment, the weight of what had just happened sinking in. And then, to Sara's surprise, Evelyn stood up, her face pale and drawn. "I didn't realize how much my presence was affecting this family," she said quietly. "I thought I was helping, but it seems I've only made things worse." Sara blinked in shock. Was this the same woman who had spent months criticizing her every move? "I think it's time I moved into assisted living," Evelyn continued, her voice steady but sad. "I've been holding on to this idea that I should be with family, but maybe that's not what's best for any of us." Tim looked as if he had been punched in the gut. "Mom, you don't have to—" "No, Tim," Evelyn interrupted, her voice firm. "I do. It's clear that things aren't working here, and I don't want to be the cause of more pain." Sara felt a wave of emotions, relief, guilt, and sadness all at once. She had never imagined that Evelyn would willingly leave, especially after all the tension and conflict. But there was something in her mother-in-law's eyes that told her this wasn't just about the fights or the police showing up. Evelyn had come to a realization, just like the rest of them. Their family had been tearing itself apart, and something had to change. A few weeks later, after Evelyn had moved into her new apartment in a nearby assisted living facility, the Johnson home felt different. The tension had lifted, and although there were still unresolved issues between Sara and Tim, they were beginning to talk more openly. The quiet in the house was a welcome change, but it also felt like a fresh start. For the first time in months, Sara felt like maybe, just maybe, they could find their way back to each other. It wouldn't be easy, but now there was space to breathe, space to heal. And as she stood in the backyard one evening, watching the sun set over the quiet neighborhood, she realized that sometimes the most unexpected endings are the ones that offer the greatest hope.